On May 13th, 1985, a standoff ensued between Philadelphia city authorities and a radical communal group known as MOVE, who had transformed a local home into a makeshift compound. This confrontation ultimately culminated in one of Philadelphia's greatest tragedies, the police dropping an explosive device on the roof of the house. This devastating and highly controversial decision resulted not only in the destruction of the MOVE compound, but also the burning of the entire surrounding neighborhood, claiming the lives of 11 people, including 5 children, and leaving a lasting scar on the city's conscience. Join us as we explore the details of the MOVE organization and its many controversies, the deadly showdown with the police that led to the bombing, and the aftermath of one of America's most blatant acts of police brutality. Amid the backdrop of social upheaval and civil rights activism in the United States, an organization called MOVE was founded in 1972 by a man named John Africa. Strangely, despite being written in all capital letters, MOVE isn't actually an acronym, but rather a call to action. The group was founded with the intent to fight for environmentalism, communalism, and a rejection of modern technology, medicine, and science. This might sound like your average nature-loving hippie gathering from this era, but the return to nature rhetoric was only half of their agenda, with the other half being openly anti-government and anti-police, considering themselves revolutionaries fighting against oppressive laws and customs. Although the founder's name wasn't originally John Africa, but rather Vincent Leipart, members just liked to adopt the surname Africa to symbolize their commitment to their heritage, an aspect of the group that is often criticized as a bit too cultish. Over the few years following its creation, MOVE continued to recruit new members until ultimately gaining enough of a following to begin living a communal lifestyle. Eventually, they purchased a house in West Philadelphia, which not only became their place of residence, but also a staging ground for the many protests they organised against the government or local corporations. This constant activity led to several calls to the police about the MOVE house, with neighbours filing numerous noise complaints and several requests for the MOVE compound to pick up the trash around their house. And though no confrontations happened with the police due to these complaints, tensions with law enforcement, the mayor, and the rest of the city were building. In 1977, a protest organised by MOVE escalated well beyond a peaceful demonstration, leading to the arrests of 3 members who were jailed for inciting a riot. This led to further tensions between the police and MOVE, as well as armed displays of defiance and violent threats. It was also being rumoured that the group was hoarding weapons in their house. By this point, the MOVE compound had become enough of a disturbance that the Philadelphia Police Department obtained an official court order to force them out of the home. Everyone expected this to be a legal or even physical battle, but MOVE leadership was actually quick to agree to the terms of the relocation and even agreed to surrender their firearms, all on the condition that the 3 jailed members would be released as part of the deal. However, striking a deal with law enforcement didn't sit well with a few MOVE members who believed that such an action went against everything they were fighting for. Several members decided that following orders from a government body was against their beliefs and announced that they would refuse to vacate the property. The following year, the police obtained a warrant to enter the house and forcibly remove the occupants, which is when the real trouble started brewing. The moment police officers attempted to enter the house, they were fired at and a shootout erupted. The chaos lasted for about an hour, during which 16 police officers and firefighters were injured and one officer, James J. Ramp, was killed. Eventually, the MOVE members surrendered and were taken into custody. All 9 were charged with third-degree murder and sentenced to a maximum of 100 years in prison. Convictions which was strongly contested by MOVE due to the fact that there was a real possibility that Officer Ramp had actually been killed by friendly fire. In fact, a recent Guardian article noted this. Eyewitnesses, however, gave accounts suggesting that the shot may have come from the opposite direction to the basement, raising the possibility that Ramp was accidentally felled by police fire. In the end, the chaotic events of 1978 and the death of a police officer only foreshadowed darker days ahead. As though they weren't dead, the trial earned the convicted members a status similar to that of martyrdom, even gaining them the nickname the MOVE 9. Ultimately, their convictions only served to intensify the actions of the rest of the group, as MOVE relocated to a new house in West Philadelphia and resumed their protests, just more isolated and radicalized than ever. By now, MOVE had been outright classified as a terrorist organization by both the mayor and the chief of the Philadelphia Police Department, and many of its members were wanted for various charges such as illegal possession of firearms, contempt of court, and making terroristic threats. In addition, MOVE was even more of a public nuisance at their new house than their previous one, once again leaving their property covered in trash, having numerous confrontations with the neighbours, and having set up a megaphone that was constantly blaring out political announcements to the neighbourhood, often regarding obscene topics and filled with profanity. This was allowed to go on for a few years, but in 1985, Philadelphia decided it was time to put an end to MOVE once and for all, and obtained arrest warrants for 4 of the members living at the house. Knowing how the previous confrontation with the group had gone down, the police prepared heavily this time around, and on May 13th, 1985, nearly 500 officers and firefighters arrived at the neighborhood. Nearby homes were evacuated, water and electricity were cut off, and a siege was brewing. However, MOVE made it clear that they wouldn't leave the property under any circumstances, and so the house was surrounded. Philadelphia Police Chief Samble then read out a long announcement on a megaphone which began with, "Attention MOVE, this is America. You have to abide by the laws of the United States." As you can imagine, after it started with this, MOVE ignored the rest of the speech and refused to respond. And after further attempts at negotiations had failed, the signal was given to enter the property. But as soon as police moved forward, another shootout erupted, with MOVE members firing out of the window and the police firing back. Police ended up firing more than 10,000 rounds of ammunition at the building, but because the building had been somewhat fortified, not a single one of these rounds hit a perpetrator. The gunfight went on for about 90 minutes until the police chief made the fateful decision to bomb the compound. Using a Pennsylvania state helicopter, 2 bombs, which were nicknamed entry devices, were dropped on the roof of the house. The bombs were comprised of an explosive compound called Tovex and some C4, which had been supplied by the FBI and were intended to break through a bunker-type structure on the roof. But the explosion had more of an effect than just smashing in this bunker, as this was also the spot where MOVE's gas generator was located. Immediately upon exploding, the gas storage ignited, and within a matter of minutes, the whole house was catching on fire. According to later reports, the new plan was to let this fire rage and to not put it out until the roof had collapsed, which would then allow law enforcement to more easily launch tear gas into the interior of the building and flush everyone out. However, the fire began spreading a bit more quickly than everyone had anticipated, and after 20 or so minutes, it began threatening to spread to nearby houses. Ordinarily, this is when such a plan would immediately be terminated, but this wasn't an ordinary situation. The fire department, who was standing by, rushed onto the scene to contain the flames, but were ordered to stand down when MOVE began firing at them, leaving the fire to do as it pleased. Soon after, the fire was spreading too quickly to contain, moving from house to house and filling the whole neighborhood with thick smoke. It wasn't until 11:47 p.m. that the fire department announced that the flames were under control, and nearly 10 whole hours after the bombs had dropped. In the aftermath of the blaze, 61 neighboring homes were completely destroyed, leaving more than 250 people homeless. Back at the MOVE compound, the fire that swallowed the building took the lives of 11 occupants, including 5 children, and only 2 members survived the encounter. Birdie Africa, who was only 13 at the time, and Ramona Africa, the single surviving adult. Ramona refused to testify in court and eventually served 7 years in prison on riot charges. Immediately following the event, it was clear that there would be some backlash for what had gone down. Nobody was about to argue that MOVE was an innocent, peaceful group. After all, they were the ones who'd opened fire on the police for the 2nd time now, and showed no intention of cooperating with law enforcement. After their first encounter that left 1 officer dead and 16 injured, you can't fault them for showing up heavily armed and prepared. However, it's quite the escalation to respond to this initial and somewhat expected hostility by bombing a house with 5 kids inside. Not to mention the 61 homes of innocent neighbours that had been burned to a crisp as a result of poor planning. What makes the decision to bomb the house even more questionable is the fact that not a single police officer was killed during the standoff. In fact, the only police injury came from a SWAT member being shot in a bulletproof vest, which left him with a bruise on his back. One can imagine a situation where dozens of officers are down and wounded in a huge gunfight, and dropping explosives on the house seems like the only way to put an end to the violence, but that wasn't at all what happened. In reality, it seemed more like the police had shown up with the intent to use the entry devices they'd constructed and waited until what they felt like was an appropriate amount of time before dropping them on the house. A few months later, the Philadelphia police chief resigned, hoping to disappear from the public eye before the hit the fan. Around the same time, Philadelphia Mayor Good created a formal investigation committee to report on the incident. It took several months to complete, but when the committee finally issued their report, it was nothing but critical of the police actions, denouncing every one of their decisions and stating that the dropping of the bombs was unjustifiable in any manner. The mayor issued a formal apology to the public and the victims, but that was about the extent of the city's actions at the time. No one was criminally charged. The public was understandably infuriated that those responsible had seemingly evaded justice, and as news spread across the nation, Philadelphia was nicknamed the city that bombed itself. The real repercussions wouldn't come for a few years though, until in 1994, when Philadelphia was the subject of several lawsuits filed by individuals and groups hoping to appeal the judgment that provided immunity to the police and city officials. The case was a bit complicated, but ultimately the court decided a few things. First, that there was no claim to a breach of the Fourth Amendment, which prohibits unconstitutional search and seizure, because no search or seizure had been technically performed during the bombing. In addition to this, they affirmed that the police and public officials had qualified immunity, but crucially, that the city of Philadelphia itself did not. Ultimately, this led to a federal jury ruling that the city had used excessive force and ordered Philadelphia to pay $1.5 million to survivor Ramona Africa and various relatives of other victims. In addition, Ramona was awarded with $500,000 for emotional and physical harm suffered during the ordeal. In an attempt to restore the homes of all the innocent neighbors whose lives had been uprooted overnight by fire, the city government paired up with a private developer to rebuild the residential area that had been reduced to ashes. They worked efficiently, and within just a couple of years, every house had been rebuilt. However, once the residents moved back in, complaints began piling up regarding poor or even dangerous build quality, a suspicion which was confirmed in 1995 when the governor of Pennsylvania summoned the United States Army Corps of Engineers to perform a thorough inspection of the buildings. Their report found that all 61 of the rebuilt homes were not up to code, leaving the city to attempt further repairs and renovations across the city block. However, this too couldn't fix all the issues in the horridly built housing, and a new civil trial was brought against the city by the displaced residents in 2005 for the harm they'd experienced. This trial resulted in a federal judge ordering Philadelphia to pay nearly $13 million to the affected families on top of finally solving the housing situation. Ultimately, Philadelphia realized that the residential block was going to be insanely expensive to rebuild and decided to instead settle a cash payout with most of the residents, basically paying them off to simply leave the area and abandon the doomed housing. It seems like it couldn't get any worse, but somehow the controversy doesn't end there. The remains of two of the children that perished in the Move compound, 12-year-old Delisha Orr and 14-year-old Katricia Dodson, were taken to the University of Pennsylvania following the bombing, where they were kept at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. However, in 2021, the bones were transferred to Princeton University for a brief period, at which point no one really knew where they were. Then, suddenly, they surfaced in a series of video lectures for an online forensics class called Real Bones: Adventures in Forensic Anthropology, in which the bones and their physical trauma were analysed for academic purposes. Relatives of the two were appalled to learn this, with one stating, "They were bombed and burned alive, and now you want to keep their bones." The University of Pennsylvania hired a legal team to investigate the matter, and their official report stated that the bones of Delisha and Katricia had never been stored at the university. However, a legal team funded by the city of Pennsylvania found the opposite and stated there was sufficient evidence to support their continued presence in the university, a report which was supported by 9 certified forensic anthropologists. Truly, after all that had happened, you wouldn't expect a reputable university to hire a group of lawyers to lie just to keep a couple of cadavers. But here we are. Soon after the dispute, the remains were given to their living relatives who handled them accordingly, though it is still debated if all of Patricia's remains were given up. As for the rest of the victims' bodies, the city maintained that they had gone unclaimed after the bombing. However, in 2021, it became known that Philadelphia's health commissioner had recently ordered the cremation and disposal of the remains without any attempt to identify them or contact their families. The health commissioner resigned amid the scandal, but it turned out that despite his orders, the bones hadn't actually been cremated. The day after his resignation, workers at the medical examiner's office, digging through their archives, found a refrigerated box of bones labelled Move, and soon after confirming their identities, the remains were finally sent to their respective families. From the potential friendly fire back in 1978 all the way to arguing over the victims' bones in 2021, the whole situation is just a mind-boggling series of terrible administrative decisions that unfortunately led to the deaths of several children. In the end, the Move bombing incident will forever be one of Philadelphia's greatest scandals and acts of police brutality. Topped with the unapologetic aftermath, it's certainly a day that won't be so easily forgotten by the city's residents.